was beautifully done. As I mentioned earlier, if you would like to hear more, we invite you to come back tonight for a very sweet time together as we praise our Lord with one another. At this point, our children are dismissed for their children's choir. This will be their final rehearsal before tonight. They've been working very, very hard since September on the special musics that they'll be blessing us with tonight, and so we hope you can come back to hear them. I want you to, for now, turn in your Bibles to the book of Ruth, where we have been now for this Christmas season. We've been taking a temporary break, of course, from our series in the book of Revelation. And maybe, I was thinking about this week, if I time it just right, and I would have to time it just right, but when we resume Revelation, if we cover Revelation chapters 6 through 12 and take 2 Sundays for every chapter, that'll land us nicely in Revelation chapter 12, and that'll be our Christmas series for next year. And there you will see a rather violent Christmas in Revelation chapter 12. But I wouldn't put much stock in my ability to keep my own preaching calendar very well anyway. You all know that. I don't do a very good job of that. But nevertheless, I thought it would be a helpful goal anyway. But we are now in Ruth chapter 3. As you know, we've begun each week by reading from each act as it has been presented to us in Ruth. And we try as much as we can to divorce ourselves from knowing the way that the book concludes. And I ask you not to turn yet into Ruth, or to the book of Ruth, in keeping with that, so that you can hear it being read and be drawn into the drama of the story as it unfolds, and help separate yourselves from the conclusion that you already know, and pretend as though you are the original audience hearing about this historical narrative for the very first time, and you can be therefore caught up in the surprise and the unique way that the story is written in these 4 acts that follow the chapters in our Bibles, each act with 3 different scenes that continue to stress for us the good providence of God over seemingly inconsequential and irrelevant circumstances of everyday life. So if you would listen as we now read Ruth chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, and it may be well with you? Now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." She said to her, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." Then he said, "May you be blessed of Yahweh, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now, it is true, I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as Yahweh lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And again he said, give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it. And he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. And then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And then she said, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today. Last week, as this story unfolds in a rather hapless and hopeless condition, beginning in chapter 1, in the days of the Judges, we finish the second act with a scene of almost a celebratory kind of excitement. In fact, it is a scene that maybe would resemble a giddy kind of juvenile excitement as these women are overwhelmed by the grace of this particular man, this unexpected man, who had taken these individuals, as it were, under his own wing, under his own gracious provision. Over 5 verses, the 5 verses that conclude chapter 2 to finalize that last scene in the second act of Ruth, over these verses, you have this conversation that goes from Naomi to Ruth, then Naomi to Ruth again, and then back to Naomi. There is sort of a rapid-fire succession of conversation and back and forth between these 2 women. He said this, and then he did that, but then what did he say when? And well, he did this, and you won't believe when he said and did this. That's kind of how the conclusion of Act 2 ends. They are overwhelmed by Boaz's hospitality, and Naomi makes this statement, may he be blessed of Yahweh, may he be hesed of Yahweh. We see now sort of this movement, not sort of, it is a movement in Naomi's heart from the angry bitterness toward, well, now what is really a restoration of her faith. But it is subtle. It is, even if you will, maybe just a glimmer of faith that she now has, and even not one that is long-term. By that, I don't mean that it is a fickle kind of faith, but rather a faith in the fact that Yahweh is going to provide for their immediate needs, though not necessarily their long-term needs. But something is demonstrably changing in the heart of Naomi, as she is being reminded of, as she is being confronted by the grace of God that she thought was merely a myth or theoretical at best, as Ruth goes out to glean at the beginning of the chapter. And by the beginning of Act 3, in chapter 3, several more weeks have passed, and that has allowed Naomi to reflect on one of the most important and precious doctrines of Scripture that give us both joy and comfort and hope in times that are good and times that are bad. Providence. Providence. We've talked about that doctrine before as we have been moving through this book week by week, chapter by chapter. And you remember, of course, how angry and bitter Naomi had been toward Yahweh. Yahweh, as far as she was concerned, was the source of her anger, the source of her bitterness. He was at fault for her predicament. After all, it was he who had allowed, if not caused, the famine that led her late husband Elimelech to leave their land and go to Moab, even if the famine was the result of God's punishment for the sinful rebellion of God's people. During this time of the judges, this time that is characterized by every man doing what is right in his own eyes, this lawless time in the nation of Israel. And that is the classic unrepentant heart. I remember going back, and I think I've shared this with you before, going back to my days as a rescue mission chaplain, and you see so-and-so in a service after a while you hadn't seen them, and so-and-so is there, and you say hello, and they say, oh, I just got out of prison again. And you ask, oh, why were you in prison? And they respond with something similar to, well, that cop caught me, and he just put me through the ringer, and the judge and the cop and the cop and the judge, and you see what the judge and the cop did, and they just, there's this judge and the cop, and it was the judge and the cop. That's why I was in prison. In other words, they were angry with justice and the consequences of their actions, but they had no biblical repentance, no remorse for what they had actually done. They had not repented over the sin that brought just punishment, and so it was the punishment itself that led to the consequences. And that was very similar to the heart of Naomi. It was Yahweh who brought this famine against the land. Never mind the reason why he brought famine against the land, as he exercised just judgment in order that his people would repent and return to him. But Yahweh surely caused this famine that drove their family to Moab, where her husband would die. And not only her husband, but where her 2 sons would die. All that she had would be taken away from her. And oh, she knows that this is the hand of Yahweh. It is the hand of God that has done this. She doesn't waver one bit in this one thing that she's confident of, and that one thing that she is confident of is the sovereignty of God over all his creative order. And that included his sovereignty over her family. She doesn't waver on that. She knows he did this. It was God, El Shaddai, who had taken away their food. Then he took away their land. Then he took away her husband. And then he took away her 2 sons. God did that. The way Job put it, Yahweh gives and Yahweh takes away. But where Job then says, blessed be the name of Yahweh, or the word blessed in that particular form in Hebrew there in Job 1:21 can also be translated praise. Praise Yahweh, the one who gives and the one who takes away. At the end of chapter 1, verse 20, Naomi in effect says, oh yeah? For what? Blessed be the name of Yahweh who takes away. I don't think so. Yahweh has his hand against me. Yahweh has caused my bitterness. Praise Yahweh. Why? Why bother? This God who seems to arbitrarily take away anything that is good, anything that gives comfort, anything that gives peace, anything in this world that can give joy, even a temporal joy, even though that things are passing and fleeting in this life, even though in this life we are under the curse of sin, and she understands that. Even though in this life there is the ultimate need for the Redeemer to come with a capital R, the one who would come to crush the serpent's head and place back into order all of God's creation and reverse the curse. She knows that. And yet, nevertheless, why worship God who is a God who will take away from even his own children? I mean, he just seems like an angry God. A God who is unfair. Again, we understand that, as Job recognized, there is really ultimately nothing that is fair. We want nothing that is fair in this life, because fair is immediate and swift and just punishment for our sin, for offending a perfectly holy God who in no way deserves our rebellion, but because we are suppressors of truth in unrighteousness, we want to serve the creature rather than the Creator. That is anathema. And therefore, every breath we breathe is the abundant hesed of Yahweh, the abundant grace, the abundant mercy, the abundant joy, the unmerited favor that he shows to us. We're not worthy of anything, but nevertheless, in Naomi's eyes, this is a God who is just simply not fair. But she doesn't know what God is doing. And as she returns to Bethlehem, Ruth, this Moabite daughter-in-law, who is a loyal, humble servant of Yahweh, determines to show Naomi grace. And as the weeks go by, Naomi is only now beginning to see the grace of God as she sees his providence, his providential work, his providential activity in the affairs of her life. And it is because of that important doctrine that I believe every Christian should, at least to one degree or another, be students of history, because providence is something that is impossible to see in the moment because we can't foresee the outcome. In fact, the 17th century Puritan John Flavel said that we can only see providence now like the disjointed wheels and scattered pins of a watch. That is a helpful illustration. Indeed, Naomi's life, as she observes how God has dealt with her, seems like nothing more than the just disjointed wheels and scattered pins of a watch. But we study church history, and providence is what gives us confidence that Christ is building his church. We see his providential hand working through sinful men and sinful people to accomplish the building up of his people. Seeing providence makes you read the Old Testament with excitement as you see the providential hand of Yahweh working through the circumstances of sinful man to accomplish his redemptive purpose, to bring his kingdom. Seeing providence is what makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you read the genealogies. In case you've ever wondered what in the world those things are there for and what you can possibly get out of them in your devotional life, you see beyond perhaps more than anything else in the genealogies the infinite wisdom and providential care of God using sinful and wicked people who will nevertheless accomplish his perfect and good will. Providence is the doctrine that teaches God's personal, detailed, wise, and good sovereignty over his creation. Because of God's providential work in his creation, we pray. Providence is how Yahweh answers our prayers. The Protestant reformer Ulrich Zwingli said that providence is the enduring and unchangeable rule over and direction of all things in the universe. God who freely supplies all with all things. John Calvin also wrote that it would be cold and barren of God to leave creation to itself, but instead God is also an everlasting governor and preserver. He sustains, he nourishes, and cares for everything he has made, even the least sparrow. Theodore Beza also added that nothing happens by chance and without a very righteous decree of God. John Owen also added that God even governs human suffering and evil. In fact, Isaiah chapter 45, verses 5 to 7 says, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that men may know from the rising to the setting of the sun that there is no one besides me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other, the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am Yahweh, who does all these. Did you catch that? I cause well-being and create calamity. So what is providence? Well, the Heidelberg Catechism, written in 1563, question 27, anticipated that you would ask the very same question December 22nd, 2019. I had to think about the date there for just a minute. The almighty and everywhere present power of God, whereby, as it were by his hand, he upholds and governs heaven, earth, and all creatures, so that herbs and grass, and rain and drought, and fruitful and barren years, meat and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, yea, and all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. You'll understand that it was the German Protestant reformers who wrote that, upholding the sovereign good work of the Lord as he exercised providence over his creation, even as the grass grows. That is the degree of the minute detail that God governs his creation. And immediately following it asks, what advantage is it to us to know that God has created and by his providence doth still uphold all things? I'm glad they asked that question, because no doubt you have been wondering, and especially in the most difficult times, what advantage is it to know that God has created and by his providence doth still uphold all things? And so they also anticipated that on December 22nd, 2019, you would ask that question, so they answered it for you. And they said that we may be patient in adversity, thankful in prosperity, and that in all things which may hereafter befall us, we place our firm trust in our faithful God and Father, that nothing shall separate us from his love, since all creatures are so in his hand that without his will they cannot so much as move. So now we come to chapter 3. If you haven't done so already, you can turn there now to Ruth chapter 3. Naomi has had several weeks now to think about that. about 4,500 years before the Heidelberg Catechism would be written. As Ruth comes home day after day with an abundance of food beyond their need. Something like 50 pounds at the end of chapter 2, an ephah. It would have been enough food to sustain the two of them for at least a week, more than likely. Which means each day as she comes home from that kind of generosity, per Boaz's instruction to his servants to leave a part of the barley harvest behind for Ruth, so she's not just gleaming one little strand of barley here and there, but she has easy access and in abundance to glean, to abundantly provide for her, and his servants then taking Boaz very seriously and understanding also the intent of his instruction, the heart behind it, the generosity that he desires to express to these poor women. They grace them. They extend hesed to them, and providing them with this kind of generosity week after week would have been, by the end of the barley season, enough to provide food for up to a year. That's a pretty good day's labor. I mean, this is a harvest that would have taken a little over a month, so you can imagine a context where so much generosity exists extended to you that you can provide for yourself and for one who is in your care for the course of a year in a month. Boaz is abundantly kind. And what had become obvious to Naomi is that all these circumstantial chance events, you remember that we looked at that last week, this one place in the Bible where we do see chance actually being talked about, because there is this sort of play on words. By chance, Ruth chanced upon this field of Boaz. Well, these chance events were actually the good providential sovereign work of God. Over these weeks, Naomi came to realize that Yahweh is clearly even superintending Ruth's decisions right down to something so banal and so meaningless as to her choice in which field to glean. And that is incredibly uncomfortable to Arminians, who uphold that mankind must have the right to autonomously make whatever free will decision that they would make. But here, clearly, God is involved in Ruth's decision pertaining to which field she will glean. Naomi recognizes it. She recognizes that God is in control of Ruth's choice. And it is incredibly ironic that an Arminian might hate this doctrine when we can see that God's superintendence, his providence, even over Ruth's decisions here, is anything but good. Neither Naomi or Ruth could have ever predetermined this outcome. And there is tremendous freedom in that, in understanding how God providentially works. And so often we can get so bent out of shape about where we're going to live, or what job we're going to take, or where we're going to go to school, or if we're going to go to school, or who to marry, or which field to glean. But really what we need to be concerned with is living according to the word of Christ, and God will superintend the rest to accomplish whatever he desires to accomplish. And whatever he desires to accomplish will be good and in accordance with his plan to bring his redemptive purpose in the world so that he might bring his kingdom. And Ruth understands that beautifully. And that is why in scene 1 and 2, or in scene 1 rather of Act 2, she is faithful to God. And because she is confident in God's providential care, she acts to do what needs to be done. She doesn't worry. She doesn't get all bent out of shape. I mean, what if I picked the wrong field here? And this is potentially disastrous for her. And in a very real way, this could have been disastrous to her. It could have been disastrous for her physically. This is the period of the judges after all, and there's a reason. We'll note that later, in just a minute, why Boaz instructs his servants not to lay their hands on her, because that is an incredibly common occurrence. But she is confident, and she acts in order that she might glean among the harvest, after one in whose sight, she says, I might find favor. It's faith. Ruth is confident in the providence of God. And by the way, who taught her that? Certainly wasn't Naomi. Ruth is just a woman of remarkable faith, a lovely and gracious woman. And some have even noted that the faith of Ruth here is a faith that would surely have even surpassed the faith of Abraham, because when Abraham leaves his countrymen for the land of Canaan that God has promised to him and his descendants, that he would bless him with, and he had all his wealth with him then, and his livestock and his possessions and his family. Sure, he leaves the land of his family, but he has everything else, all the other securities of this life with him when he goes there. I mean, it is a commendable act of faith according to Hebrews chapter 11 on Abraham's part. But nevertheless, Ruth, when Ruth leaves her land in Moab, she doesn't have any of those things. She leaves all of her possessions and all of her people. But in order to be a worshiper of Yahweh, she chooses a life of certain destitution. And not only does she want to offer praise to the one who takes away, Yahweh who takes away, and trusts him in certain destitution because of it, but it actually required even greater faith that she could be a worshiper of Yahweh, because Yahweh had actually said that no Moabite could ever enter the assembly of God's people. Ever. Even unto the 10th generation, which was a way of saying never. So how in the world can Ruth say, but I will, a Moabitess? Well, she had faith that God is a God of grace. How did she come to that conclusion? Was it her circumstances? Was it Naomi's response to their circumstances? The God of Israel is Hesed. But what about her life circumstances taught her that? No doubt she was a fool in the eyes of Naomi. And that's why the villagers and the elders of Bethlehem and Boaz are all surprised and stunned by the character of this Moabite girl. That's why Boaz himself commends her and prays that may Yahweh bless you. That's why he calls her his daughter. That's why he extends such kindness and mercy to her. All of Bethlehem has heard about the faith and character of this woman from Moab who came to Israel to be a worshiper of El Shaddai Yahweh, who had taken everything from her. And as we come to scene 1 of Act 3, this is the first time we see faith on the part of Naomi, as she is repeatedly confronted by the loving graciousness of Yahweh's Hesed over these last few weeks. She says to Ruth, in this first act, you might call this first act this first scene in verses 1 to 5 a petition for peace on earth, or not really earth, but peace for Naomi anyway. She says to Ruth, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you?" Manoah, that means peace or place of rest. Naomi wants peace for Ruth. And notice that there is nothing here about redeeming the land or the lineage of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. There's nothing here about security or peace for herself, but this is the first honorable and sincere expression of Hesed by Naomi to Ruth. This is a genuine concern for Ruth's well-being, and in response to that genuine Hesed toward Ruth, Naomi wants to articulate a plan in order to accomplish grace and peace for Ruth, a long-term solution. Naomi realizes that this is really a no-win situation for Ruth, and she can continue to benefit here. In fact, it would be safer for her to do so. Ruth can continue to glean in the field of this very generous man, and nothing changes. Naomi eventually dies. Boaz dies, but he's probably going to die after Naomi anyway, and if he does die after Naomi, Ruth will probably at least be able to glean for a little bit longer, but eventually Naomi's going to be dead, Boaz is going to be dead, and Ruth is going to be old. Who takes care of Ruth then? And by the way, I think Ruth would have understood that, even if there was any hope for her in Israel and providing for her mother-in-law, that there was no long-term solution for her destitution. It would go way worse for her than it would ever go for Naomi. She would never have a daughter-in-law to care for her. Eventually, she'll be too old to glean in the fields, and no one would come to her. No one would care for her. No one would extend Hesed to her. She's a Moabite woman. She has no reason to expect that at all. Naomi knows that too. And so now she says that she desires to seek security for Ruth, that it may be well with her. And in this context, the kind of peace that Naomi wants is the security and peace and satisfaction that a woman might find in the home of a loving and gracious husband. In fact, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 9, this is the same root for the word rest that you find there. May Yahweh grant that you may find rest. This is while Naomi is returning to her hometown of Bethlehem before she enters into Israel from Moab to the east on the other side of the Jordan, and she says it to Orpah, and she says that to Ruth, and that's why she tells them to go back to their native land and their native people and their own families, their mother's household. Find rest. May Yahweh give you rest in worshiping other gods, false gods. And so you see what's just happened. After all these weeks and even months, Yahweh is about to use Naomi to answer her own prayer, even as deficient as that prayer was, and even as faithless as that prayer was. And what an incredible God then that is. He's using Naomi to answer her own faithless prayer. And he can transform even the most bitter hearts, even from the prayers of the most bitter women. And this is the first time after Ruth had demonstrated such kindness and generosity and initiative and grace towards Naomi that Naomi demonstrates a remarkable act of faith here. This is extremely risky, and the consequences could be disastrous to both of them. It's hard for us to understand how risky this plan is because of our 21st century context, but for them, this is incredibly risky. And so why in the world would she ever devise this plan unless there had been something Naomi had become convinced of, having grown in wisdom, and that is that God is both sovereign and He is good. He is Hesed, and now this too is Naomi's conviction and not just Ruth's and Boaz. He is abundant in kindness, abundant in mercy, abundant in grace, abundant in peace, and abundant in His goodwill toward men. But this is nevertheless, a very dangerous and a very delicate plan. But Naomi knows that God who cares for them will providentially work to provide for them even if her plot is foiled. And there are a number of things that could go wrong with this plan. First of all, Israel is not a safe place in the daytime, let alone at night. We know that. Remember, even Boaz has to tell his own servants not to lay their hands on Ruth while she's gleaning in the field. These situations were rife with opportunity for abuse as these destitute and weak women without husbands and without families labored in the fields. And according to the Deuteronomical law, guess whose responsibility was to evict justice, to avenge those who've been wronged? Oh, it was family. And so who would evict justice? Who would avenge wrongdoing for Ruth? Well, this is an opportunity for crime without consequence. And so these fields were already rife with opportunity for abuse. Rape was virtually the norm, or worse. And remember, we read about the Levite priest in Judges 19 who gives his wife over. Yes, the text says concubine, but you have to understand concubine in the context of Old Testament Israel, and it is not concubine in the context that we would understand it necessarily today. In that context, in Judges 19, a concubine would have been a wife who was also a servant, somebody whom you were providing for, someone who you were paying. And so she's a concubine, yes, but she is also a wife. And so this Levite priest gives his wife over to be raped to death while he sleeps in Gibeah. And that was just on the north side of Jerusalem. Bethlehem is just on the south side of Jerusalem. And remember that the Levite wouldn't even stay in Jerusalem because he saw Jerusalem as even a more dangerous place. And Bethlehem is where they were coming from. Bethlehem is within sight of Jerusalem. And Naomi's plan will require Ruth to be out alone in this environment without Boaz's protection because he isn't even supposed to know that she's there. Naomi tells Ruth, keep at a distance. Presumably, the only reason she gives her that instruction is so as to prevent anything from potentially foiling the plot. Stay at a distance from everybody. Lest somebody confronts you and steers you away from where you need to be at the right time. So, that's just one potential outcome. Something could happen to Ruth and she never even makes it to the threshing floor. Not only that, if all goes well, though, she does make it to the threshing floor, and Naomi is wise to the fact that Boaz is in the threshing floor, and he'll be sleeping there, and that is itself because of the dangerous environment in ancient Israel. And so if all goes well at this point, Ruth makes it to the threshing floor. Lots can still go wrong. The threshing floor is a notorious place of prostitution, and Moab was a notoriously sexually perverse people. In fact, you remember that this is a people that was conceived in gross immorality, gross sin, in deceptive incest. Lot is a nephew of Abraham, and he is living in Sodom when God comes and destroys Sodom and Gomorrah with fire because of their gross immorality. And as Lot leaves with his 2 daughters and his wife looks back against the Lord's instruction, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. And now it's just Lot and his 2 daughters, and they are essentially living in caves. And the daughters, in their act of faithlessness, say, it is unlikely that we'll ever find a man, a husband, through which our father's lineage could continue and inherit the land. And therefore, they devise this plan to get their father drunk so that they can sleep with him and so that they can conceive in a horrendous act of faithlessness and perversion. Grossly immoral conception here. And so the oldest daughter gives birth to a son, and his name is Moab. That is where the Moabites would come from. So right from its very beginning, this is a people that are notoriously perverted. And Moabite women in particular, during the period of the Judges, were common prostitutes on the threshing floor as well. And so how would Boaz interpret Ruth's presence there? This is like the red light district. This is risky. It's probably why Boaz himself is sleeping there. He is the owner of the threshing floor, so he can sleep wherever he wants, but the threshing floor is not going to be a comfortable place to sleep. It's an allergenic nightmare for one thing. You're tossing all day this grain into the air so the wind can blow it away, and it is a windy place, and it's going to be a cold place. This is the month of April, upper 40s, low 50s at night, and it's a desert environment. It's clear, and for those of you who are of the outdoorsy type, you know that the coldest nights are the clearest nights. And so in Bethlehem, it's going to be a clear night. It's going to be a cold night. This is also going to be a windy place in order that the chaff can be blown away, and then the grain would fall to the ground for the harvest. And Boaz is sleeping here, one, to prevent thieves from coming in and stealing the grain, such as Gideon was afraid of in the book of Judges, and also so that most likely to prevent any kind of infidelity from occurring on his threshing floor, because he's a righteous man and he doesn't want this happening here. So he's guarding his threshing floor in sort of a dual sense. And so here comes this Moabite woman to the threshing floor, which was a common act of a prostitute. So how's Boaz to interpret that? Well, this wasn't a place where she was supposed to be, and Boaz might totally reject her and throw her out and end his kindness toward her because he miscalculates her intentions. You can understand how that would happen. Worse, Boaz is a godly man, but he is still a sinful man. And this is the period of Judges, after all, and he might misinterpret Ruth's intentions in a different way and maybe assume that Ruth just wants a progeny on Naomi's behalf so that they can raise a son in the name of Elimelech. And so he might lie with her so she can bear a son without ever actually granting Naomi's prayer for peace for Ruth. Or, maybe worst case scenario, this whole thing could turn out like it did for Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. She was the wife of the son of Judah. And was so evil that the Lord took his life. And so his brother Onan took Tamar as his wife. Remember, this is the whole Levirate marriage thing to keep the name of from being stamped out of the inheritance of land. Onan would marry Tamar, and Tamar would conceive, and they would name the firstborn son And when he came of age, Onan would give his father's property back as an inheritance. And so his name would not be stamped out of the inheritance in Israel. Well, if Tamar wouldn't conceive, then Onan would inherit his brother's land. And so Onan, perverse and corrupt himself, what happens is after dies, we read in verse 9 that he goes into his brother's wife and then wastes his seed on the ground. In other words, he consummates the marriage thinking that this would secure his brother's property, but he makes sure that there would be no offspring so that he gets to keep his brother's property, his brother's inheritance, and his own. Greed is his motivation. That was Onan's plan, but God took his life too. Boaz may very well try something similar here. I mean, Naomi knows that he is a notoriously respectable man, an honorable man, but her plan would test the limits of his integrity to be sure, because no one would know about this. All of these are possibilities. This is a dangerous plan, a risky plan, a delicate plan, but a plan of faith and confidence in the providence of God, that he will continue to work his providence and care and provision over, well, in Naomi's intentions, Ruth, but that isn't the end of Ruth's intentions toward Naomi. And so in scene 2 that begins in verse 6, Ruth does everything her mother-in-law tells her to do. She washes, she anoints herself, and we read that she puts on her best clothes. Now, many have wrongly interpreted that, I believe, to mean that, she gets all dolled up. It wouldn't hurt. And bathing after laboring in the sun, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. We like to bathe in our household. We don't like to stink. We don't like when our boys stink, and so we give them a bath at least once or twice a week. Hopefully on Saturday night before they're sitting with you here on Sunday. That's not what's happening, though. Ruth is actually ending her period of mourning. And Naomi's instruction to her to wash herself and dress herself in the best clothes. You see, best is actually in italics in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 3, because best isn't really the proper word here. The word clothes is a word for outer garment. It was the same kind of word that would have been used for both men and women. There would have been a different kind of outer garment for women than there would have been for men, and so you could, you would be able to distinguish between a man's clothes and a woman's clothes, but this is basically like a coat. Put on your coat. Not put on your best clothes. She's destitute. What best clothes? But put on your coat. You're going to want to be warm. But put on your coat and wash yourself and anoint yourself. This is symbolic of ending her period of mourning. This is actually the exact same phrase that David uses to describe his ending of mourning in 2 Samuel after he sins with Bathsheba and a son is born to them, but the son then dies because of Yahweh's discipline against David for his sin. And when David hears the prophecy from Nathan the prophet that their son would die, he mourns. But then when the son is born and dies, once the son has died, David then ends in this period of mourning. And when he ends the period of mourning, he washes himself and anoints himself and changes his clothes. And so this is what Ruth is doing, and it is going to communicate to Boaz that she's no longer mourning the death of her husband. And she's ready to live life as you would normally live it, which would include the prospect of marriage for her. So Ruth does that, and she is not to make herself known to the man until he finishes eating and drinking. It's very practical. He lays down on the threshing floor. She pays attention to it, then go in after him, uncover his feet. There are all kinds of commentators that believe that this is euphemistic for something sexually perverse, and it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. When it says, Naomi says, Ruth, uncover his feet, she means uncover his feet. It's a very practical thing. I don't like to sleep with my feet uncovered. You probably don't either. And we live in our comfortable, warm houses. And again, they are on the threshing floor. It's going to be cold. It's going to be in the upper 40s, low 50s, and it's going to be windy. So there's a wind chill factor involved, and that's going to be an unknown. But nevertheless, you uncover somebody's feet at night. At some point, they're going to follow in the sleep cycle, and they're going to stir, they're going to wake, they're going to be chilled. And in fact, that is what happens, because we read in Act 2 that Boaz has eaten and he's drunk and his heart is merry. He goes and lays down at the end of the heap of grain. She comes in, and then in verse 8, it happens in the middle of the night. The man was startled. That's actually the word for shiver. He shivered. So that's Naomi's intent. Smart woman. Uncover his feet. He's going to wake up. And what's going to happen when he wakes up? Well, you can propose a marriage to him. That's uncommon in our culture. That was uncommon then too. I don't know if you've heard of a leap year marriage, but I hadn't until this week. And my wife hadn't until this week, but some of the funny things you turn up sometimes in sermon prep. But during the Reformation, the leap year was considered to be mainly a Roman Catholic idea, since the Pope himself had established the concept of the leap year, allegedly. And so Protestant kings actually rejected the idea of a leap year. And so then that meant that February 29th, the additional day that's tagged on to the end of February every 4 years, is a non-day. Well, the king rules over his nation every day, but a non-day. And that meant on the non-day, there were no laws to govern the land. And people could do whatever they want. And part of what they would do and whatever they wanted was to overturn societal norms and expectations. And if you were a woman and you were really disappointed by the lack of prospects of men coming to you asking for your hand in marriage, this was your one opportunity every 4 years to go and ask a man to marry you. I know, in case you were wondering, 2020 is a leap year, so anyway, this is not something that is going to be expected. But she does. She goes and she proposes to Boaz. And he is surprised. He's groping around and trying to figure out, and you can hear his surprise. He says, "Who are you?" She answers, "I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." Now, this goes beyond what Naomi asks her to do. She wants peace for Ruth. And so, but she says, spread your covering over your maid. That is actually the same thing that Boaz prays back in Ruth chapter 2, when he says, "May you be blessed by Yahweh. May he extend his kindness to you. May he extend his wings over you." In verse 12, "You have come under the wings of Yahweh, the one whom you have taken refuge." And so now Ruth is telling Boaz, answer your own prayer. You are the one who will answer your prayer in God's providence. He will use you in the same way that Naomi answers her prayer. or I should say, is the answer to her own prayer. Now Boaz also becomes the answer to his own prayer, and his response is, I cannot believe that the blessing is mine. And this goes exactly as had planned, because Boaz is a righteous man, a man full of integrity, and a man concerned about his integrity, and that's why he tells Ruth to stay, so that no one would ever say that a woman came to the threshing floor this night. He's concerned about his integrity. He's concerned about perception and false accusations and the consequences that might incur to him and Ruth. That is always a concern of an individual of integrity, that integrity is maintained. And now he says, I will marry you. Boaz clearly loves her. This is a godly love. This is, in fact, the kind of love that every marriage is to be designed to illustrate. This is the kind of love that the marriage is supposed to illustrate, that Christ has for his church. This is the kind of love that only believers can have toward one another, in fact, because this is a love that is modeled after Yahweh has said. How can you have a love that models itself that so selflessly after Yahweh has said if you deny that Yahweh has said? Boaz extends this abundant grace, abundant love, abundant kindness to her, and he says, I'll do for you whatever you ask. Now, for you young men who might be single, or old men, whatever the case may be, just realize that it's extremely unlikely, too, in this leap year that this will happen to you. So that might be also something else we could glean from the text. But nevertheless, Ruth is a young woman. She's in her mid to late 20s at the latest. She's been married to her first husband for 10 years. Boaz, an older man, mid-50s, late 50s, he doesn't expect this, and he says, but I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. And he says that you have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. I mean, you're not going for the guys with the groovy beards, heads full of hair, and the Mustang convertibles. The horse, not the car. This is, ancient Palestine. But she goes after a man who is godly. And so he says, I'll do whatever you ask. But as to the latter part, you are a close relative. She is appealing to him as a kinsman redeemer, except he's not a kinsman redeemer. This isn't a Levirate marriage. That was only something that a brother would do on behalf of his sister-in-law. It's not Boaz. This is just a marriage that is conceived in love, that Naomi develops and encourages because it is so unexpected. But nevertheless, Ruth declares this statement of concern for her stepmother's provision. You are a relative. It is in effect asking Boaz to redeem Elimelech's land. But there's a problem. This whole thing could not have possibly been going better until verse 12. There's a relative closer than I. No. I mean, you've been reading this for the first time. This is totally unexpected. It could not go this way. Now what? And so there's another element of insecurity again, in which Ruth and Naomi have to trust in the providence of God. And so she obeys him. In the last scene, she goes in the morning, rises up before anyone can recognize another, and he said, let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And again, he said, give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she holds it, and he measures 6 measures of barley and lays it on her. And then she went into the city. And so he shows grace again to her. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And actually, the way this is written in Hebrew, it's actually a parallelism with this very same thing that Boaz says in verse 9. Who are you, my daughter? She doesn't say, how did it go, my daughter? She says, who are you, my daughter? In other words, she is saying, what is your name? Tell me who you belong to. Do you belong to me or do you belong to Boaz? Well, Ruth tells her all that the man had done for her, and now you see Naomi's faith. In verse 18, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. And in fact, what we're going to find out tonight is that while Ruth is still traveling to her mother-in-law and having this conversation before the sun is even up, Boaz is already making his way to the city gates to resolve this issue and providing for Naomi and also providing peace for Ruth. Tremendous grace. He sees this as nothing less than a tremendous privilege to be the man who would fulfill his own prayer that they would be provided for, and he would be a redeemer. And of course, what we're going to see tonight is that ultimately, not only is Boaz going to unnecessarily fulfill this role according to the law, but it would be through the blessing of this marriage and actually in answering the prayers of the people in Bethlehem that the Redeemer of Redeemers would come to save his people from their sins. That is an important point because we are all in need of a Redeemer. I think it's interesting. In 1915, Benjamin B. Warfield made this point to incoming students at Princeton Theological Seminary, asserting that to Christ's people, his most precious title is Redeemer. And the reason, he said, is because it gives expression not merely to our sense that we have received salvation from Jesus, but also to our appreciation of what it cost him to procure this salvation for us. And he proves the point not through the church's theology, but through the church's hymnody. Listing song after song extolling Christ as a Redeemer, or for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. All hail, Redeemer, hail, for thou hast died for me. I will sing of my Redeemer and his wondrous love for me. On the cruel cross he suffered from the curse to set me free. And he listed 28 such hymns. And then he listed another 25 hymns that have the word ransom to celebrate Christ's sacrifice. You know, it was interesting. Out of curiosity then, I went to look at how many of our contemporary songs include the word Redeemer. In the last year, out of the 100 songs that were the top 100 songs in contemporary Christian music, not a single one of them mentioned redemption. Not a single one. Out of the last 10 years, the top 500 songs that I searched through looking for some word Redeemer or variant of the word Redeemer, ransom, or whatever, I found one out of the last 500. I think that is only because we have lost our understanding of our need for a Redeemer. We have so belittled sin that we're no longer in need of ransom. So why would we worship Christ as being our Redeemer? Well, Ruth recognizes the need for a Redeemer. She recognizes the need for this human Redeemer, to be sure, but she is ultimately going to recognize her need for the Redeemer of redeemers, and she has confidence in through God's providential care that he will bring one to crush the serpent's head. Let's close in prayer. Precious Father, Lord, we are so grateful for this wonderful season in which we are reminded that you have brought our Redeemer because we are sinners in need of redemption. And through his work, we can be reconciled to you by grace through faith. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.